I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to the usual updates from the military and political front lines, we assess the state of the Russian army, hear new revelations from inside the Biden administration, and look deeper at the impact of this war in other theatres, such as Korea and Africa.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Keep stand strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 15th of November, 2 years and 271 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, and academic, author and analyst at the Royal United Services Institute, Dr. Samuel Ramani. I started, though, with the latest news from the battlefield. It would seem that the primary targets of Russian bombardments have shifted southward in the past 24 hours, with large strikes hitting the port city of Odessa last night. The settlement, of course, being the subject of a special episode we did on Wednesday, so I recommend that to those interested particularly in what's going on there at the moment. Now, most of the air targets are believed to have been intercepted, but some clearly got through, killing one woman and injuring 10 other people, according to the State Emergency Service report. The Oblast governor there said an apartment building was destroyed and several high-rise buildings damaged. The heating supply to 220 apartment blocks with a population of 40,000 and as well 7 kindergartens, 4 schools and a maternity hospital were also damaged. Now, across the country, Russia attacked several regions with 2 guided missiles from the Black Sea and 29 Shahed-type attack drones from Crimea. The Ukrainian Air Force confirmed that 1 guided missile and 25 drones were shot down. There have been several casualties noted in Donetsk, Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk. Now, also, we hear that Kharkiv, Luhansk and Mykolaiv, as well as Sumy, Poltava and Zaporizhia Oblast were also attacked, but no casualties have been reported there. Given the numbers of projectiles allegedly being fired, it is clear that the warning systems adopted by the government, in tandem with the defences and measures taken by civilians, have greatly reduced the casualties that would otherwise be expected. But nonetheless, strong words by President Zelensky this morning in response to these attacks. He's put out a statement saying, quote, "Last night, Odessa suffered a combined massive attack involving missiles and drones. Assistance is being provided to everyone in need. I'm grateful to everyone involved in rescuing our people and eliminating the consequences. We are constantly defending ourselves against such attacks, and we constantly need effective protection from this terror. We keep repeating that Ukraine needs more air defence systems, the capability to destroy means of terror on enemy territory, defence packages, and increase sanctions pressure on Russia." Now, Russia too experienced its own major drone attack last night, with Krasnodar region coming under a significant bombardment by drones, believed to be targeting a military airfield. The governor there said that the Russian air defences intercepted approximately 36 drones, which is included in the overall tally that they mark of 51 Ukrainian drones overnight across the entire country, including 36 over Krasnodar, as I say, 10 over the Azov Sea, 3 over Russian-occupied Crimea, and 2 over the Belgorod region. So a real spread across the border between Russia and Ukraine last night. Some are interpreting that this would be a deliberate approach to show that all the talk of negotiations is for the birds at this present moment, which would, of course, go against what many believed would be the most likely situation, which would be that Moscow would tone down with their attacks to suggest that the lines were frozen and that the time was right for negotiations. But the fact is, bombardments have gone up, and in Kursk and other sectors, particularly, the Russians are pushing extremely hard. Kursk remains a key card the Ukrainians have to play in future negotiations. But I want to dedicate most of the rest of this section to the state of the Russian army. So much Western analysis focuses on the state of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think the inbuilt assumption of that focus, even though it is vitally important, is that it matters more because the scale of Russia means that its state of play doesn't matter as much. But it is essential not to lose sight of the severe losses the Russian military is suffering at the moment and the economic burden that is putting on the state. And in that vein, a fascinating piece has been published by the BBC today. So using open data, its journalists, together with the publication Media Zona and a team of volunteers, has managed to establish the names of at least 78,329 Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine. They're not saying that that is the total figure, they're just the ones they've been able to identify publicly. They stress that the rate of growth of the confirmed death toll is currently the highest in the entire war for Moscow's forces. The figures for September, October and November are 1.5 times higher than last year's figures and more than twice as high as 2022's. Now, tellingly, the average age of the confirmed Russian fatalities in 2024 has reached 38 years old, a significant jump from the average age of 21 years old in the first months of the full-scale invasion. So to quote this report, in the first 3 months of the war, the typical Russian soldier killed was a 21-year-old contract soldier serving in elite units. In 2023, the typical dead soldier was a 33-year-old prisoner who went straight to the front from prison. By the fall of 2024, the portrait of the average Russian soldier has changed again. Now the most common dead soldiers are volunteers, that is, those who signed a contract after the start of the invasion. These contract soldiers differ significantly from professional soldiers. Before being sent to the front, they undergo only minimal training, which lasts in different cases to 3 to 10 days. Even propagandists have begun to point out that many volunteers are now dying or going missing within 12 to 18 days after signing a contract. Now, that death toll may explain why there were reports this week of protests by soldiers in the Novosibirsk region, where a riot was staged in a barracks and many soldiers fled. It reportedly took place 2 days ago, and that is a report coming from various sources, and we always have to be tentative here, but I think that there's also been footage that's been released and is indeed being talked about by Russian mill bloggers, which would suggest its validity, particularly given that it's a negative story from the perspective of Moscow's forces. And basically what we've seen is at least 10 soldiers escape from a barracks there since recaptured. And it also speaks, I think, another story, fascinating small one, from the former Kursk region governor, who admitted that the Russian military personnel there in that operation robbed houses from Russian citizens that had been abandoned by local residents. So soldiers literally robbing from their own citizens, telling you quite a lot, I think, about the culture and discipline in the ranks at the moment. Crucially, this doesn't just have an impact on the military, but on the economy. In another small but telling story, a Russian fish canning factory in Kaliningrad has started importing labour from India to plug manpower shortages. Russian industry has long complained that those shortages have been triggered by military recruitment and is causing major production problems. But the fact is that many young men are being incentivised to fight. In one of the most important pieces published this week, the Wall Street Journal showed how, in their own words, going to war is now a rational economic choice in Russia's impoverished hinterlands. They go on, the state offers high salaries and bonuses to entice new recruits. In some of the country's poorest regions, a military wage is as much as 5 times the average. The families of those who die on the front lines receive large compensation payments from the government, life-changing sums for those left behind. One Russian economist calculates that the family of a 35-year-old man who fights for a year and is then killed on the battlefield would receive around 14.5 million rubles, equivalent to $150,000 from his soldier's salary and death compensation. This economist says going to the front and being killed a year later is economically more profitable than the rest of a man's further life. And he goes on to describe this phenomenon as Deathonomics. The journal article goes on. So many soldiers have been killed that the payments, totaling as much as $30 billion in the past year as of June, are a telling symptom of how the war is transforming Russian society and the economy at large. Since the start of the invasion, the Kremlin has boosted military spending to post-Soviet highs, offsetting most of the impact of Western sanctions. Weapons factories work around the clock, providing employment and high wages. So a really interesting piece. But how long can these losses and costs be sustainable for? That remains the trillion ruble question. without a clear answer at this stage. There have been, though, several reports, including in the Kyiv Independent, that Putin has modified the compensation scheme promised for Russian servicemen wounded while fighting in Ukraine, possibly indicative that they are trying to cut the mounting costs of the war and restore balance to the economy. But Roland's going to discuss that in a little bit more detail shortly. Despite all this, there is still plenty of evidence the Kremlin is bullish at present. And on that subject, I'm going to bring in Roland right now. Roland, I see that our old friend, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, has been chattering away this morning. What's he been saying?
Was he a friend of yours, Francis? Do you hang out on that famous yacht? You must invite me one day. Yes, no. So Dmitry Peskov has been speaking. He speaks pretty much every day, actually, on a briefing call with wires and so on. The thing I think that is worth pulling out now is actually a remark from yesterday on his briefing call, where asked by journalists whether Russia had any plans to appoint a special envoy to deal with the question of the Ukraine war, he said no, because President Putin is directly involved in addressing this issue. The special military operation is underway. He is the supreme commander-in-chief of the armed forces. We have no special envoy for this. Now, that is basically a response to a reporting by Fox News previous day on the 13th that Donald Trump plans to appoint a special envoy on Ukraine, presumably as part of his plans to end the war, broker some kind of peace deal. And I must say, it's not the first time we've seen significant gaps between what Trump's stated or signaled intentions are with his plans for talks or to end the war and the Kremlin, which has shot down a couple of things that he's presumably been floated tentatively, not officially from him. I think Peskov's telling the truth there. We know that the one area of policy Vladimir Putin is definitely interested in and does take a personal, deep interest and control of is the war in Ukraine. And he is ultimately the decision maker. So I think that signals that Russia is only going to be interested probably in talking Trump himself, a president's talking as equals. So we'll see how that develops. But again, to put that in the context, Francis, as if anyone needs reminding of the context, post-election, new president-elect who's basically signaled that he's going to seek to force some kind of peace deal. And this has triggered all kinds of diplomatic scrambling on both sides of the Atlantic. It's also triggered stuff on the battlefield. So I think it's fair to say that this big Russian push to retake Kursk region with this, as we're told, 50,000 man army, including North Koreans, is premised on the idea that if they can get that back by the time Donald Trump is in the White House, then they've deprived the Ukrainians of a key negotiating card if these talks take place. Just a little bit more diplomatic back and forth just to highlight this. So German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is apparently going to speak to Vladimir Putin today, Friday. It will be the first time they've spoken in almost 2 years. So a sign of things picking up. Remember, Olaf Scholz is facing a snap election in Germany in February as well. I don't think we can separate all those things from that. Meanwhile, Viktor Orban, our old friend in Hungary, has of course popped up and said, well, once again, he's said this before, that the EU needs to rethink its sanctions policy in order to ease energy prices and so on. So we're going to see more of this quite intense kind of diplomatic jockeying and signalling in the coming weeks and months, I think, up to January and the inauguration of Donald Trump in Washington. And on that, actually, Francis, there was an interesting article in the American political publication, The Hill, which speaks to this. And it's worth highlighting because I think it gets to the crux of the dilemma that I think is facing Western policymakers. So this is a piece it's an opinion piece. It's by Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth. Mr. Sweet he's a retired US Army intelligence officer. Mark Toth is a national security and foreign policy writer. And they basically argue that Joe Biden's administration got themselves into a terrible impasse on this war very, very early on. And their argument is that it all began, the path to this point, this kind of stalemate or difficult point for Ukraine, was basically set early on in the war when General Mark Milley, the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs, asked his counterpart, Valery Gerasimov, okay, in what circumstances would Russia use a nuclear bomb? And they argue that by asking that question, he basically gave the Russians a blank check to tell the Americans how far they're allowed to go in support for Ukraine. Apparently, they're citing Bob Woodward's recent book about the Biden administration here. Gerasimov's response was this: if there's an attack on Russia that threatens the stability of the regime, that's condition one. Second, if a foreign power attacks Russia with a weapon of mass destruction, that's chemical, biological, or nuclear. And third, Russia reserves the right to use tactical nuclear weapons in the event of catastrophic battlefield loss. And you can see how that third condition, clearly, I think that fits with all the reporting we've seen, has influenced American policy towards Ukraine. Well, we know from our reporting and others reporting what happened in the autumn of 2022 when America and the broader West inexplicably failed to rapidly reinforce Ukraine as the Russian lines collapsed and they were facing imminent defeat in Kherson. And it's been reported regularly by multiple journalists, multiple sources, that basically what happened there is that the Russians signaled that no, we are prepared to use a nuclear weapon at this point. The Americans took that at face value, slow-rolled the response, and that, from the point of view of many people, and I think the point of view of the authors of this article at least, missed the opportunity to win the war on the battlefield. So the question is, what does Donald Trump do in response? Their argument is, of course, no surprise, these guys are, I suppose, Ukraine hawks. They say you need a Ukraine first policy that arms it to win. You need to lift the restrictions on long-range strike and storm shadow and things like that. Donald Trump, of course, seems to be signaling something else. He seems to be signaling we'll consider suspending support for Ukraine unless the war is frozen or ended. They argue that's incoherent, and it's incoherent because if you look at Donald Trump's kind of signaled preference of foreign policy, it's make up with Russia somewhat, end the war in Ukraine, but go really hard on Iran, go really hard on China. They say this makes no sense at all. Russia and Iran and China, of course, are allies and part of the same axis of power. They argue it's not a coincidence that, a year or so after Russia invaded Ukraine, Iran activated all of its proxies across the Middle East, so on and so forth. We will see more and more of this kind of intense debate in Washington and in Western capitals, and indeed in Kiev, in the coming months. So that is the diplomatic overview at the moment, Francis.
Well, thank you very much for that, Roland. Well, let's go to another story then that I mentioned in my section earlier on, which is this story of Putin approving a reduction in compensation for wounded soldiers participating in the war against Ukraine. I think this is interesting because until now, it feels as if the state has done everything in its power, economically, culturally, to be incentivizing soldiers to fight. But this, as I say, some people are interpreting as a sign that all is not dandy and they're looking to reduce some of the money that is going towards soldiers who have fought and indeed perhaps to save some rubles. But Roland, what's the more details on this story?
Right. Okay. So this is a measure that Vladimir Putin approved on November the 13th. So on Wednesday, he approved this. It's a reduction in compensation for wounded soldiers, specifically. So the current maximum amount of compensation is 3 million rubles. That is around, at current exchange rates, around $29,000. But the severity of the injury is not considered for the allocation. So it doesn't matter whether you've lost both legs or one toe, you're going to get the same amount of money. This change classifies injuries into three categories. So the payment for a severe injury, that's going to remain at 3 million rubles, $29,000 or so on. A minor injury, 1 million rubles, about $10,000. And for other minor injuries, or things classified at that's the classification, other minor injuries, you get 100,000 rubles, around $960. And those details are carried in TASS, one of the Russian state news agencies. This decree doesn't specify how they're going to classify the severity of given injuries. This reminds me, sorry, it's a little bit of an aside, but anyone who studied pirates when they were at primary school might remember that in the Articles of War on a pirate ship, it was very, very detailed, actually, about how much you got for example, loss of an eye, loss of a leg, different kinds of injuries. That doesn't seem to have been published in this particular case, but I suppose they'll have to work that out. Now, the Anna Sivilova, the Deputy Minister of Defense, who discussed this at a meeting with Andrei Belousov, the Defense Minister, on Wednesday, said the current rules create a sense of distortion among the soldiers. So they're framing it as, look, people who have been really badly injured don't understand why people who haven't been that badly injured are getting the same amount of money as them. But you're right, it does feed into this narrative of the Russians running out of money, but definitely beginning to look to tighten the belt here and there. There was another interesting piece in Kommersant, Russian Business Daily, I think last week. Was it? I'm grabbing this off the top of my head now, Francis. So go and look. But anyway, the Russians have restarted a reform program, which is going to involve firing, I think, several 100,000, an awful lot of civil servants, essentially. Now, that's justified as saying, look, there are far too many people on the books, and that means that people are not being paid a living wage. So we're going to rationalize this, and we're going to lay off huge numbers of people. And they also say, look, this is a process we began in 2020 before the pandemic. And that's true, they did. We had to freeze it because of the pandemic. Then there was a war. We're getting back to it now. But that is a drastic reform, which is the kind of thing a government that is looking at the sustainability of its books undertakes. And I must say, I had a conversation with John Healey, the British Defence Secretary, the other day, and his message was, look at the losses. You mentioned the losses, Francis, in your segment about how October was according to British Defence Intelligence, the most costly month of the war so far for the Russians. He said, put that together with the economic data, and it's difficult to see how Russia is going to maintain its current tempo of war fighting beyond another year or so. So there's definitely a lot of people in the West, a lot of Western governments, a lot of Western analysts looking at all these signs and thinking, I'm not sure this narrative that Russia is unstoppable and can go on forever really stacks up.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to definitely be returning to that, Roland. And just one final story from you. I mentioned culture earlier on and the atmosphere in Russia at the moment. And I know that there's one other story on recent denunciations that's caught your eye.
Yeah, so I was just looking at the wires. Reuters has published an interesting feature today on the culture of the denunciation, the donos in Russian, so which of course has unpleasant Soviet connotations about people denouncing friends, family, teachers, whoever. So this piece focuses on the case of Nadezhda Buyanova. She's a 66-year-old pediatrician at Moscow's Polyclinic 140, who on Tuesday was found guilty under a wartime censorship law of publicly spreading deliberately false information about the armed forces and sentenced to 5.5 years in a penal colony. Now, this particular case, and they use it as a case study to get into the bigger issue, but I do think it's worth paying attention to. So this particular case dates back to January, and this is when the mother of a patient, the mother of a 7-year-old boy with an eye complaint, complained that they went to see the doctor, and she told the doctor, oh, my son's upset, he's traumatized because his father died fighting in Ukraine. And then the mother, after leaving the hospital, complained or claimed that Dr. Buyanova replied, what did you expect? Your husband was a legitimate target of Ukraine. Now, Buyanova denied making the remark, and her defense lawyers complained they weren't allowed to put their own questions to witnesses, and it's all relying on one woman's testimony. You might question whether anybody should be jailed for such a remark, even if she had made it. But the point is that this is not the only case. So Reuters is citing a Russian human rights group called OVD Info. They say they've recorded 21 criminal prosecutions based on denunciations since the launch of the invasion. And that's part of a broader kind of pattern that they, according to their figures, more than 20,000 people have been detained for various forms of anti-war statements or protests, and more than 1,000 criminal cases launched, not all of them explicitly linked to denunciations. But I think that this is definitely speaks to the kind of the atmosphere inside Russia and how careful you've got to be about what you say and who you're saying it to.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for talking us through those interesting updates. I think, as I said earlier on, that we do tend to focus, for obvious reasons, on Ukraine at the detriment of Russia sometimes, we being collective journalists in the West. But actually, it is vital that we keep our eye on what is going on in Russia, because when things change in autocracies, they change very, very quickly indeed, less quickly than in democracies. But on that subject and lots of others, I am really pleased to welcome Dr. Samual Ramani of the Royal United Services Institute to the podcast. He's also an academic at Oxford Oxford. I've not heard of that, but at Oxford. And he's a regular contributor to the Telegraph as well, and author of several books, including Russia in Africa and Putin's war in Ukraine. Now, Sam, you and I speak quite regularly on these subjects, and there's lots of things that we can bring in, but really you're an expert on the way that Russia operates outside of its own theatre in Ukraine, particularly. And so I want to start with your reflections on North Korea and South Korea and the significance geopolitically in the Pacific of the decision by North Korea to send troops to Europe, South Korea's reaction to that, and perhaps most importantly of all, how the reaction in South Korea differs from what we're seeing in Europe, which seems rather dismissive, one might say. But Sam, welcome. Pleasure to have you.
Really great to be here, Francis. Yeah, I've been watching this podcast for a long time, and it's really good to be on now. And yes, I would like to break down the topic of North Korea and Russia because it's something that's very interesting and something that I've been following for quite a long time. I've been engaging with stakeholders both in Washington, here in London, and in Seoul about it over the past several weeks. So I can bring in exactly what you're saying, that disconnect and that dissonance between the view in Seoul and the view in the West. Well, I think that basically this is a marked strengthening of the Russia-North Korea relationship. When Kim Jong-un and the KCNA media were reporting back in June when Vladimir Putin visited Pyongyang and signed the strategic partnership agreement, this was something stronger than was ever during the Cold War, was stronger than the 1961 agreement between Khrushchev and the North Koreans. Some people wrote that off as hyperbole. But now we're seeing something that is really unprecedentedly strong in terms of their cooperation. The North Korean-Russian cooperation is multifaceted. It, of course, includes the mass delivery of war material to the Russians. There were estimates of about 3 million shells that were being delivered during the first 6 months of the deal starting in September of 2023. Now, given the fact that North Korea also has a war economy that's being ramped up, there's a possibility of around 8 million shells arriving in containers and more to come in the coming year. Effectively, North Korea is sending more shells to Russia than the entirety of the European Union has been able to send to Ukraine at points. So that's a serious indictment of the underinvestment in European defense industries before 2022, still slowing things down. You've also got Wasdaq 11 missiles coming. You've got a cyber agreement where both countries are agreeing on a common internet space and maybe coordinating on offensive cyber capabilities. It was interesting to note that North Korean hackers actually used to hack Russia a lot more than they actually coordinated together against Western targets. That's something that's quite important. And then, of course, the entry of North Korean forces into Ukraine. So this is a very broad-based, multifaceted relationship that is now manifesting itself with actual deployment of ground forces. Why do I think that this ground force deployment is quite significant, and why do I think the West should be paying more concern about it? And certainly people in Seoul are. Number one, even though the North Koreans have not participated in a large-scale attritional conventional conflict of this scale since the Korean War of 1950 to 1953, they have had notable experiences serving as engineers, technical advisors, and as logistical supporters in other conflict theaters across the globe. So we've seen North Korean pilots, for example, fighting alongside Egypt during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. We've seen North Korean forces to the tune of around 3,000 work quite effectively in support of the MPLA in Angola. We've seen them in Mozambique in support of Frelimo. We've seen them supporting Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and most recently, allegedly, in support of Bashar al-Assad in Syria in the battle for Aleppo. And in all of those conflicts, they were able to serve as force multipliers reasonably effectively and be able to make a battlefield impact. And as you can see, those were in Lusophone countries, Arabic-speaking countries. Now they're in Russia. So they can adapt to different and changing geographical and cultural environments, maybe much more easily than some people expect. And that's something that's very firmly on the mind of South Koreans, but completely neglected in the West, this history of relative success. The second thing that I think is quite important is that the North Korean forces are being deployed by the Russians in quite a strategic way. I do agree with what you were saying earlier in this episode, that the Russians have something of a deadline to try to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. They want to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk before the Trump administration comes in, because Ukraine will be denied the chance of achieving any kind of a land swap deal or using this as diplomatic leverage, which if you listen to Zelensky advisor Mikhail Podolyak and many other Ukrainian officials, was always the goal of the Kursk offensive. It wasn't about taking territory. It wasn't about taking the pipeline in Suja or anything like that. It was about taking enough land and holding it for enough time for a land swap. And the North Koreans allow the Russians to be able to continue their offensive maneuvers around Pokrovsk in Donetsk and also abortively, as we've seen in Kupiansk, while not drawing forces from there, but still being able to defend Kursk. So I think that strategically they have significant value, and we should be paying quite close attention to that. And I think that so that's why I think they've got clear strategic intent, and they have a history of being quite effective. So when we see the British ambassador to the United Nations say that this is an act of desperation, or we see NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte say the same thing, and other mainstream media talking about it in that way, it's certainly not what's being felt in Seoul. And I think that the people in South Korea want more urgency and more development. The big question is, will the West jump in these last few months before Trump takes over? Will Europe jump in? Or will South Korea have to take matters into its own hands? The South Koreans have a bit of a complication, of course, in terms of supporting the Ukrainians. Poland has ruled out the transfer of South Korean equipment that's already been delivered to them to go to Ukraine. South Korea has got a law that restricts supplying military assistance to active conflict theaters, but they have a substantial amount of things that they could use, like 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery shells, as well as long-range missiles, like the Taurus missiles that the Ukrainians have been wanting from Germany, or the Tomahawks that they've been wanting from the Americans. So the South Koreans feel sufficiently threatened, and they feel that their other Western allies are not doing enough. It is a clear possibility, at least from my engagements with Seoul, that the South Koreans will want to step in and maybe take matters into their own hands. So this is something that's quite serious. I also think that the North Korean issue may also be a reason why some Europeans are seeking to re-engage with Russia at this time. Like the Schultz and Putin phone call idea actually was not just reported after Trump's victory. It started getting reported in Die Zeit and other German outlets back well over a month ago, in October, after the North Korean troops began streaming in and the reports began streaming in. It was talked about as something that might happen on or around the BRICS summit. The Russians were dismissive. So I think that some European leaders are starting to take this issue a bit more seriously, and maybe that's going to factor into a little bit into Schultz's discussion with Putin. But I think that right now, Seoul feels a bit vulnerable. It feels like the West is underestimating the threat, and it's increasingly willing to do what it hasn't done for the past 7 decades and take matters into its own hands militarily.
Thank you, Sam. That's so interesting. And we've touched on this in the podcast previously, but great to hear it from somebody who's in regular contact with the authorities there. Now, just want to turn next to another, of course, key region, which we on this podcast have looked at periodic points over the course of the war. And that's Africa, a special subject of interest for you. And as I said earlier on, you've written a book on the subject. So where are we in terms of Russia operating in Africa? I think from the perspective of many listeners, the last time it would have really cut through in story terms was when the Wagner group moved from Bakhmut to operating for Russia as a proxy in Africa and was involved in working with regimes there in terms of trying to secure gold and other material mines for Russia and indeed to secure its influence over that continent. But interested in what's been happening there over the last few months, because there were also reports, of course, that Ukraine wanted to get involved there too, to show that it also realised that there were other interests in that region and to show those countries which it was reaching out to that it could have a place to help them as well. So interested in your perspective on Africa, Sam.
Yes, I think it's a good time to be raising it because there's been a flurry of interesting stories just in the past several days with regards to the Russian involvement in Africa. There was a clear Russian-African ministerial conference that was being held, and the readouts from it were basically plastered all over the Russian Foreign Ministry website over the past 3 to 4 days, and basically seeing bilateral deals between Russia and a whole host of African countries, particularly showing muscle and expansion in Central Africa, which heralded the arrival of military instructors in Equatorial Guinea that we've seen recently, as well as discussions about values in terms of fighting colonialism, and also an agreement on information security, which builds on what was signed at the July 2023 St. Petersburg summit, and shows that Russia and African countries are presenting a common informational front against what they see to be the legacy media and Western colonialism. So there's a whole bunch of moving parts just in the past few days, not to mention the excellent New York Times expose into what happened to the Russians in Mali and their losses of lives there, which I contributed to and I recommend people read. So yeah, there's been lots of moving parts. But with regards to where Russia's influence in Africa stands right now, Russia has managed to overcome a lot of the turmoil and teething troubles that followed the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and they managed to keep most of their operations in African theaters relatively unchanged. For example, Khalifa Haftar in Libya was very frustrated with Prigozhin for a period of time. Prigozhin was seen as a friend of Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, and they had law disputes over payment. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal where at one point Prigozhin was literally standing with Haftar and demanding and threatening to extort $200 million out of him because he wasn't paying. So Haftar, I think, was pretty happy to re-engage and get the Russian military supervising their forces there to a greater extent. And it was pretty telling that as Prigozhin's plane was crashing into there, the Russian Defense Ministry and the Libyan National Army were signing their first official agreement on counterterrorism. So there's been stability in terms of Russia's presence in Libya, and that means that Russia has access to the critical oil ports as well as access to the Mediterranean Sea. Elsewhere, we're seeing the movement of Africa Corps and the GRU, including figures like Averyanov and some others who've been involved in planning things like the Skripal poisoning and other covert operations, getting involved in supervising where the Wagner Group forces in Mali, Central African Republic, and in Sudan. I think that in Central African Republic, it's basically been the Wagner forces have been kept and the operations have been kept as they are. In Mali, we've been seeing actually a lot more heavy equipment come, which led to some military successes in Kidal. And in Sudan, we've seen basically the Russians switch horses. So the Russians went from really aligning themselves with Hemeti via Prigozhin to now pursuing an arms for a base agreement deal with the Sudanese National Army Chief, Burhan. So we've seen some changes here and there, but in general, Russia's maintained its influence in the four key theaters of its power projection in Africa: Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, and Sudan. Africa Corps forces, or the Russian regulars, have relatively seamlessly integrated with Wagner and taken charge. The command structure changes were not as fractious as many people thought they would be. And Russia remains a major player on the continent with rising ambitions. And we see that evidenced in a variety of spheres, including their arrival of military instructors in Equatorial Guinea, and their strengthening relationships with Niger and Burkina Faso, and their movements out of traditional mining oil and arms sales. We're seeing this also even with things like the delivery of space satellites and satellite technology to different West African countries, or investments in solar energy from Rosatom. So Russia is clearly here to stay and here to diversify, and Africa is a critical component of its post-sanctions, post-Western foreign policy. And Ukraine has had some problems dealing with this. Sometimes it's been bad luck. Like Dmitry Kuleba had a really good agenda to go to Africa in October of 2022, and he was visiting the continent, but he couldn't do much with it because it coincided with the Kursk bridge attack. It coincided with the Russian strikes on civilian infrastructure, Surovikin's appointment, and all that drama that followed that. So he had to turn back. But the Ukrainians have had an issue in terms of overpromising in terms of resources. Like they want to open up 10 new embassies in Africa. They may have opened one because they just don't have enough capital to be able to invest there. And also they've been finding themselves struggling to counter the avalanche of Russian disinformation on the continent, especially on the issue of food security, where many African leaders and African media outlets give uncritical airing of the Russian perspective, which says sanctions and the mining of ports is what's causing food insecurity, not Russia's bombing of logistical infrastructures in Odessa or torpedoing of the grain deal and creation of the weaponization of food. So Ukraine is trying hard to do what it can, but it's facing a massive avalanche of Russian disinformation that's moving faster than it can move. And it's not getting enough support from its Western partners in countering that. And some of its forays into Africa have been marred with a bit of overreach and bad luck, as we saw with Kaleba's trip.
Well, thank you for that fascinating overview on the situation in Africa. Now, we could look at Russian influence in the Middle East, of course, but I think I've covered that quite a lot in recent months. So I actually want to turn to the issue of the day, which is America and its role in the possibility of negotiations and indeed a freezing of the conflict. What are your thoughts on what that would mean for Ukraine and Europe and the wider West?
Yes, the freezing of the conflict is something that has been welcomed and championed by many non-Western peace proposals that we've seen. Like we've seen the Chinese peace proposal talk about the immediate ceasefire and freezing of the conflict. It'd be interesting to see exactly what Putin and Mohammed bin Salman discussed just yesterday about this, and whether Saudi Arabia, which hosted the Jeddah talks for Zelensky's formula, would be on board with something similar. But it's a point of view that this is freezing of a conflict is something that China, many Arab countries, Africa, lots large remnants of the global South have promoted, and the West has historically chafed against and pushed back against. And now under Trump, we might be seeing an unlikely coalescence between Western and global South perspectives on the freezing of the conflict and what this means. Of course, not all conflict freezes are created equal. And there's a distinction between freezing the conflict at current borders and freezing the conflict at what Ukraine would deem to be defensible borders, and also what the Russians would deem to be acceptable. Because freezing the conflict at current borders may not actually be beneficial to either Russia or Ukraine's objectives. I mean, Russia, because they would want to have the entire liberation of Donbass, as they call it. They would want to make sure that they have achieved that as one of the cardinal features of the war, and they'd probably be willing, at least to some people I've spoken to in Russia, to cede some territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia to make that happen. On the flip side, the Ukrainians just don't want a frozen conflict, even with European police and even with some security guarantees, that has indefensible boundaries where Russia can escalate at whim, and regions that are being split between Russian and Ukrainian authority. And of course, it doesn't want to give up territory at all unless it has to, and now it's being pushed with its back to the wall. So I think freezing the conflict sounds like a good idea, and it's something that a lot of people have talked about, but freezing the conflict in a way that would make the Russians satisfied so they don't pursue further revanchist territorial gains and pursue further aggression, or would allow the Ukrainians to maintain defensible borders is a much harder task than what I think anyone in the White House has been talking about so far. And I hope that as discussions move on, that issue of preempting Russian aggression and creating defensible borders for Ukraine really rises to the fore.
Well, thank you, Sam, for that. Roland, you've been listening to all of this. I imagine you've got a question or two for Sam. Over to you.
Alex, that was all absolutely fascinating, especially the stuff about Africa. And I wanted to ask you a bit more about that, specifically about what you were saying about the Ukrainians struggling to keep up with, I think what you described as a tide of Russian disinformation that's moving faster than they can keep up. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about, I suppose, a Western role in this. So our colleague, Adrian Blumfield, filed a piece from Nairobi last week, basically about how the BBC World Service has ceded space to Chinese and Russian broadcasters in a way. the British in particular, because I suppose we're a British paper, have neglected this instrument of soft power that was at one point extremely influential across the continent and elsewhere, and that others are moving into the gap. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the last thing we should be doing at this moment in time, when Russia and China, to some extent, are on a coordinated informational offensive, is cutting back our vehicles and our outlets to promote our own counter narratives and our own information. So, cutting back on the BBC World Service is, I think, a really, really detrimental move that plays right into Russia's hands. But Russia is relying on much more than just satellite media and cable media and legacy media to promote its bidding. I mean, we're seeing a lot of attention being given to some of the clunky campaigns that RT is launching inside Africa, which are appealing to figures like Jomo Kenyatta or Robert Mugabe and lionizing them as anti-colonial heroes, bringing in friends and cousins and grandsons of these people to host shows to bring back some kind of a nostalgia for people in Africa, but a past that some may see as positive and some may see as authoritarian. But the Russians are also being more nimble in their tactics too. They're relying a lot more increasingly on local influencers and trying to mobilize the younger generation. RT Arabic was already quite effective in mobilizing many young people on YouTube and social media in many countries in North Africa and even in some parts of the MENA region. Its reach was actually superseding Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera before the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And since then, its growth has expanded further, and they've been able to leverage and capitalize on the public discontent with Western support for Israel in the Gaza war. There's also a rising trend of Pan-Africanist influencers who are starting to rise. One of them was Kemi Seba, who was a long-standing associate of Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's Beninese, and he's been, very actively involved in promoting a lot of Russia's anti-French rhetoric in Niger and in Burkina Faso, including the idea that Western forces were never interested in countering terrorism or improving governance and security. They were just using counterterrorism as a ploy to steal uranium and steal gold and plunder resources. And because these are very much real people who are expressing real points of view, and they're not bot farms, they're not troll farms, it's very, very hard for Meta and for other platforms to credibly censor them or crack down on them as disinformation, because that looks like a crackdown on freedom of speech. So the Russians have been using much more than just weapons like RT and cable media to fight. So investing in BBC World Service instead of cutting back was one step in the battle. The other step in the battle is actually trying to win hearts and minds on more of a grassroots level. We need to be stepping up our social media and our internet outreaches. We need to be also basically trying to be ahead of the game instead of behind. I noticed in so many local newspapers and so many local media outlets, the Russian ambassador gets to put his point of view out about food security or about the war in Ukraine, and then maybe months later or never at all, we get a response from a Western country. It's about time that the West kind of gets first mover advantage and can try to shape the narratives where possible. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done at grassroots level and reaching out to the vast majority of African people who are under the age of 30 or 35.
Thanks so much for that. And very, very quickly, as a kind of follow-up, it sounds like from what you're saying that Russia has got an Africa strategy. And I do sometimes get taken up on this by friends from certain parts of Africa. It's a very, very big place and it's not a monolith. But nonetheless, Moscow seems to have a target, a strategy for the continent writ large with specific goals and so on. And it seems to me from what you're saying, I'm wondering if this is what you're saying, that the West writ large, but the United States, Britain, others, just don't seem to just not be paying attention or haven't really thought about that part of the world in a way. Is that a fair criticism, do you think?
Yes, Roland, I think you're tapping in on something that's very valuable. Actually, in 2025, I'm publishing another book on Africa. It's about U.S. policy towards Africa, and the title of the book is going to be Rudderless Superpower. basically making an indictment of this very nature, that U.S. policy and by extension Western policy has been far too often reactive and lacking in the kind of strategic intent or consistency which causes them to, on so many occasions, to be behind the eight ball or promote the wrong messaging, even though there's actually a large reservoir of U.S. soft power, admiration for the U.S. style of governance, democracy, education, and public health initiatives that's there. So instead of capitalizing on their strengths, this lack of strategy is often muddying the waters and playing into the hands of America's and Western adversaries on the continent. And it's important to keep in mind that the Russian strategy in Africa is not new. It's not something that even Vladimir Putin created. This is something that originated with the Yevgeny Primakov during the late 1990s, the foreign minister turned prime minister who's a big ideological architect of Russia's movement away from the West. He called for the debt forgiveness and anti-colonial messaging, and some of the intellectuals he worked with wrote about this at the time. I recommend you look up somebody like Vladimir Lopatov. He was talking about this. The idea of opposing Western unilateralism and American sanctions and the American use of force, engaging with African regional institutions to try to promote some kind of a concept of multipolarity and including Africa as an order builder, as a contributor to the world order, rather than just as a passive pawn or a proxy of other powers. And yeah, tapping into the politics of grievance and selling arms to all sides and not interfering in politics, even if regimes are autocratic and have human rights abuses. And those strategic planks of engaging with everyone, fighting against colonialism, exploiting the politics of grievance, promoting disinformation, has been going on for about 25 years. So it's unsurprising that the consistency and repetition eventually breeds success. It didn't breed it initially, but it certainly bred it over the past 5 to 10 years. And that's why I think we should be paying a lot more attention to how this Russian strategy in Africa developed. We first started talking about Russian Africa because of Wagner and Prigozhin, but we should really be peeling back a layer and looking at the events of the late 1990s and early 2000s to understand where and how Russia made a resurgence, because it was around the same time that China also was starting to make its investment in Africa with its first major Africa-wide summit in 2000.
Now let's go to our final thoughts. But just quickly before I go to you both, listeners will know how much I love books, and so it would be remiss not to flag a new piece in our paper by friend of the podcast, Ada Wordsworth, co-director of CARP, of course, the charity providing aid in Ukraine, particularly the East. Her article is called The Best Books on Ukraine in 2024, From Chernobyl to Zelensky. Many of the authors' names will be familiar to you at home, but there'll be several that aren't, and the list includes biography, memoir, history, short stories, essays. So if you're looking for some recommended reading at this time of year, do check it out. We'll have a link in the show notes to that article. And I also wanted to mention it because she ends the piece by saying, a final note, among the many tragedies to befall Ukraine this year was the death of journalist David Knowles, who hosted this newspaper's podcast, Ukraine the Latest. I saw David in Kyiv a few months ago, the evening after he'd interviewed the novelist Andrei Kurkov. He spoke at length of his admiration for Kurkov's fiction. David always managed to combine his war reporting with a deep appreciation of Ukrainian culture. This embattled country and its friends abroad are the weaker for his loss. So thank you, Ada, for that, and thank you, Ada, for the piece, which, as I say, we will link to. But Roland, where do you want to leave our listeners with today?
I'd like to leave our guests on the sunny coast of the Black Sea, actually. I'm not sure what the actual significance of this is, but it's a very interesting development. While we've been speaking, there has basically been an absolutely enormous riot in the capital of the
Georgian breakaway province of Abkhazia, in the capital Sukhumi, where protesters have forced their way into parliament. They've thrown eggs and stones at police. Some of them reportedly tried to ram the gates of the state security service. Now, the reason for all this, we understand, is that the Abkhazian parliament was about to vote on a law that would have ratified an investment agreement with Russia. The specific grievance is that it would allow Russians to buy apartments in Abkhazia. Abkhazia is a beautiful place, as all of Georgia is really. Mountains, Black Sea beaches, very popular with holidaymakers. The protesters and the opposition leaders say that's going to give preferential treatment to Russians. It's going to drive up prices, price locals out of the market, and boost Moscow's dominance. We understand the protesters did get inside the parliament today, and that Aslam Bijania, the self-styled president, has now cancelled that law. Quite an unusual development in quite an overlooked part of the world. Abkhazia, of course, is a breakaway province. It broke away from Georgia in the 1990s in quite a bloody war. Russia is the only country that recognizes it. That was after the 2008 Russian-Georgian war. And it's widely seen as a kind of Russian-occupied province. But an interesting, very, very interesting incident down there that who knows what it means, but worth flagging for listeners, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Roland. I saw that story break just as we went on air, so I'm really glad that you were able to bring that in. But Sam, as our guest, you've got the final thoughts for today.
Yeah, I was actually going to also flag Abkhazia because I saw it breaking as we were talking about the Peshkov story in TASS. And but aside from that, I think that we should also take a moment to think about what freezing the conflict will mean for the people of Ukraine and for the people who live in occupied Ukrainian territory and who have seen basically not just the destruction of their infrastructure and destruction of their buildings and the renaming of cities and boulevards and streets into the Russian language by force and re-education of children and so many other atrocities. But the effective long-term sustenance of the separation of families, the reimposition of capital punishment. I mean, there have been many articles that have compared the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk to North Korea, totalitarian regimes of the past. We just saw a really good one, I think, in The Economist about this yesterday. And also scholars like Jade McGlynn, who is also a regular for the Telegraph in the past too, have done excellent work on this. So when we're thinking about freezing the conflict, it's not just about European security. It's not just about bringing an end to this war. It's about consigning potentially 8 or 10 million Ukrainians to an absolutely harrowing existence. And that's something that we should be thinking more about, because I think the conditions in the occupied territories, eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, and some of the radical demographic changes that have occurred in Crimea since 2014 are often overlooked by the Western media and certainly not mentioned by policymakers who are talking about a deal to end the war.
Absolutely, an inconvenient truth. Thank you very much, Sam, for your time today. Really interesting to hear your insights, and thank you, Roland, as ever, for your time. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. We're also giving university students globally unlimited access to The Telegraph, completely free of charge. Just visit www.telegraph.co.uk/student-sub. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X. Follow The Telegraph on X so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do please refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.